All right, chapter 9. We're going to talk about the rise and the spread of Islam. I'm sure, as you know, right now, Christianity and Islam have been in conflict for quite some time. Um, Christianity tends to regard Islam as totally separate from itself, when in actuality, they're all part of the Abrahamic tradition. Okay? Um, if we go back, Abraham was the father of the Jews, but he was also the father of the Arabs through Ishmael. Um, Abraham's wife Sarah was older, and so Sarah gave Abraham her handmaid Hagar as a bed warmer, somebody that he could sleep with, because she thought she couldn't have children. And Abraham was supposed to be a father of a great nation. So Abraham slept with Hagar. Hagar had Ishmael, and then Sarah, despite her age, gave birth to Isaac. And then, of course, Sarah gets jealous, and she has Abraham kick Hagar and Ishmael out, basically abandons them. And so Ishmael ends up becoming the father the ancestor of Arabic peoples. Okay, whereas Isaac becomes the father the ancestor of the Jewish people, and they have been fighting ever since. Okay, this conflict goes back literally thousands of years. So the God worshipped by both is the same God. Okay, and of course Christianity just comes out of Jewish traditions. So it's all the same God, worshipped in different ways, but the same God. Um, Holiest city in Islam is Mecca. We're going to talk a little bit more about Mecca as we go along. Um, it has a natural spring in it, which is very important for when you live in a desert environment. Um, that there's a place for water, um, especially when you're in the caravans. For many, many years, many of the people of the Middle East worshiped multiple gods. They were pantheistic. And it was Muhammad, the Prophet Muhammad, who brought them back to a monotheistic belief. Um, the uh, the Kaaba um, held a lot of the idols or a lot of the symbols of veneration of various gods when they were worshiping many gods. And a stone had fallen to earth, probably a meteorite, and each one of the various Arabic tribes were arguing over who got to keep it. Um, and so they agreed that the first passerby uh, you know, would decide where this stone would be placed in order to uh, found the rebuilding of the Kaaba. And Muhammad came by. They're like, okay, where's it going to go? And he just took it. So um, this kind of establishes Muhammad as not only religious but a political leader as well. And to this day, people of the Islamic faith still pray towards Mecca, and specifically the Kaaba. Okay. Um, Islam went through a very rapid period of growth, um, and a lot of this had to do, and we're going to talk more about this. A lot of this had to do with, at the time, its acceptance of other religious faiths. Um, Arabic, because the word of God was given to Muhammad, Muhammad spoke Arabic. Uh, the language itself was thought to be imbued with a with was supposed to be sacred, and so a great deal of effort has been put into uh, making it beautiful. Okay, and that's both the spoken word and the written word. Because it's sacred, it should be a beautiful thing. Um, Muhammad was born about 570 BCE. Or I'm sorry, CE, not BCE. Wrong direction. So about 600 years after Christ, roughly. Um, he was orphaned at age 6, did not have a lot of formal education, uh, but he he started working as a camel driver, married. He was a little bit of a gold digger, married a wealthy widow who was 15 years older than him. Um, and by 40, at 40, he heard this voice that said, recite. And he said, what do you want me to say? Um, and then he started receiving revelations from God through the angel Gabriel, um, which he in turn dictated to scribes. And these scribes wrote them down. And this is what forms the Quran, which literally means recitation. Um, the core of this is the belief in submission to God and the will of God, um, which the word Islam literally means surrender, okay, as in surrendering to the will of God. Um, he would believe that the most beautiful thing that God made was humans, okay, and that humans should therefore act as the most beautiful things in God. There's a belief in an immortal soul, like Christianity, which is not necessarily belief in Judaism, and that there is an afterlife and a reward in the afterlife. Um, the 5 pillars, okay, of Islam: witness, which is a repetition of the Shahada, which says there is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is the messenger of God or his prophet. Prayer, so daily prayer, facing Mecca, 5 times a day at dawn, midday, mid-afternoon, sunset, and nightfall. And for men, a noon prayer and sermon on Fridays. Okay, so in most of Christianity, the sacred day is Sunday. In Islam, Fridays. The giving of alms, to give alms to the poor, so which is 1/40th of your assets. Okay, so this is a requirement. Christians and Jews are supposed to tithe a tenth to the church. This is specifically giving to the poor, so a little bit different, and perhaps a little more direct means of helping. Fasting, okay, during the month of Ramadan, which is lunar, as opposed to our Roman calendar, which is broken down by days. Um, and so over a 33-year period, this Ramadan will occur uh, in every season. Um, and during this month, you fast by you abstain from food, drink, medicine, tobacco, and sexual intercourse from sunrise to sundown. Okay, so during the day, obviously, then that the same restriction doesn't occur at night. And then pilgrimage, which is traveling uh, in the 12th month to Mecca at least once in your life. So it's not something you have to do yearly, but it is something that should be done at one point in the life. The Quran consists of 114 surahs or chapters. Um, and the which begins with the Bismillah. You guys probably most of you probably know the word Bismillah more from uh, Bohemian Rhapsody than anything. Bismillah, no, we will not let you go. Right. But this literally means the Bismillah. It translates to "in the name of Allah, the Beneficent, Ever Merciful." Um, and these chapters are arranged from longest to shortest in the Quran. Um, Longest is 287, and the shortest is 3. And the mandatory prayer, the Salat, consists of verses from Surah 2, 4, and 17. Calligraphy is an important part of Islamic tradition. The idea of making the language beautiful. This is an art form that, while we have calligraphers in English, we don't. The beauty of our text really isn't important. We're very focused on content. Um, But in Arabic, making the language visually beautiful is much more important. The other issue that is run into is since the Quran is in Arabic, and Arabic is considered to be the holy language, okay, because this was the language that God chose to pass his word along to Muhammad in. Translating it means you literally lose the divinity of the text because it's no longer in the exact words. Words don't translate directly. Words don't translate directly from one language to another. Okay? And so we have to we lose something in translation, and this is a problem. And most Muslims are encouraged to actually learn Arabic, to learn the holy language so that they can read it in the original. Um, like like the Jewish Torah, like the Christian Bible, there are problematic texts in the Quran. Okay, um, but there are also texts, for example, do not let hatred of others lead you away from justice, right? Um, and so you can find what you want. If you're looking for a reason to hate and to kill in the Quran, yeah, you can find it. Um, if you're looking, on the other hand, for reasons to love and to be tolerant and to be accepting, you'll find those too. Okay, this is present in all of the holy texts of the major monotheistic religions, of all the Abrahamic religions. Um, so, perhaps if when there's problems, perhaps the problem isn't as much in the text, although the text can be problematic, as it is in the reader. Okay. In addition to the Quran, there's also the Hadith. There's a collection of Hadith, which are narratives, reports that are sayings, of Muhammad and anecdotes about his life. These aren't held on quite the level of the Quran, but they are considered to be important. In 622, Muhammad had to leave Mecca because his life was under threat by those who were still polytheistic, worship multiple gods. He fled to the oasis of Yathrib, about 200 miles away, and they renamed the area Al-Medina, or the city of the prophet. And there he created the priorities shifted. Prior to this, the base unit of society was the family, and now within this new faith, it wasn't the family, but rather it was the community of belief that became the base unit, superseding the family. Muslims were encouraged to spread their beliefs by jihad, which is basically, it means a religious struggle. We think of jihad now as the way that we in the West hear it, as strictly a physical warfare, which is not really the case. It's a spiritual warfare that can carry into physical realms. Okay. So the lesser form, holy war, or greater form, self-control over base human appetites. Muhammad did raise an army of 10,000 men, went back to Mecca, and conquered it. He destroyed all the idols that were in the Kaaba, except for the black stone itself. Okay. All right, so we see, you're probably familiar with mosques. Mosques, much like some of the early Catholic Christian churches, were very focused on beauty. We still see this today in certain religions and traditions, is this idea of beauty and the pleasurable aesthetic. An important feature of this is the Qibla, which indicates the direction of Mecca. Because if you're supposed to pray to Mecca, you need to know where it is within the mosque. And so there's always a wall that tells you to pray this direction. And there's also the minbar, which is a pulpit for the preacher. Okay. Um, During Muhammad's time, women were welcomed in mosques. That is not necessarily the case today. Um, there was some there were certain measures of equality that were within the Muslim faith that Christianity did not have at the time. But there were other differences. Men and women were expected to be guardians of each other's honor. Okay, husband guards the wife's honor, but wife just as much guards the husband's honor. But there was polygamy allowed for men only. Men could have up to 4 wives, and if you were a rank, you could have basically as many wives as you wanted. Um, Muhammad only had one wife for 28 years, but after she died, he kind of went on a spree, married to at least 10 other women. Um, if we look at one of the most common points of contention is the hijab. Okay, literally means curtain, which requires that women be covered or veiled. This actually goes back to the Jewish tradition because the Jews did it first. Um, they were supposed to dress modestly. Okay, now there's not the Quran doesn't say wear a hijab or a burqa. Okay, burqa covers the entire body but also covers the face, um, whereas the chador leaves the face open. Um, but the Quran itself is not specific. This is an interpretation that has been placed on the Quran as far as what modesty means. Okay, so we cannot mistake what's not in the book for the way that the book has been interpreted. Um, Men and women are entitled to equal treatment before the law. Justice is supposed to be given regardless of which gender. They are both entitled to have an arbiter within Sharia law. Um, people, this is one of the other difficulties that we have here in the West. People hear Sharia law, and we hear this all the time, right? Oh, Sharia law, beware of Sharia law, they're coming to take over. Yeah. So realize that that law is a thing that is very open to interpretation. It is a religious law, okay, but if you look at the way that our laws have been set up, they were largely governed by religion too for a long time. Okay, it's only been in the last few years that we've really started moving away from law that was not based in religion. Now there's a closer tie. Okay, um, but within Sharia law, there there's a wide amount of disagreement between various people as to how different things should be interpreted. So it's not like you say Sharia law and it means this. It's like, okay, this is the principle. How is this going to be interpreted? All right. So there's a much wider range of interpretation in here than a lot of people like to suggest. Um, Sharia does tend to favor men over women. Marriage is a reciprocal relation in which a man owed his wife support, while a woman owes her husband obedience. Okay, so support versus obedience. That's a massive difference. Um, Men get to have multiple wives. Um, a man could kick a woman out without basically over pretty much almost anything. Um, but a woman had to bargain to end a marriage with her husband. Um, and women only got temporary custody of their children after a marriage was terminated. Uh, Ultimately, the father and the father's family gained control. Um, Now, there are pushbacks against this currently. Okay, some of these traditions right now, but it is slow coming. And actually, traditional Arab culture uh, before Sharia law actually gave women a lot more freedom in some ways. Women could divorce their husbands. Woman could keep her children, but as well. I mean, both of those were options, not necessities, but options. Okay. After Muhammad died, the caliphs took over. Caliphs, think of them as religious as well as political rulers. Um, and really kind of three factions came out. Very conservative one. The Kharjites felt that the caliphs were immoral. Um, excuse me. Um, Ali uh, was one of the potential successors to Muhammad, uh, and there are those who believe that only his descendants should uh, rule. Uh, the Ali being a descendant of Muhammad, so basically only descendants of Muhammad should be allowed to rule. They currently live largely in Iran and Iraq. They're known as Shiites. A much larger group believe that religious leaders should be chosen by the people, um, and they're called Sunnis. Um, Israel's Israel. Islam spread very rapidly, conquering the caliphs conquered Damascus, Persia, Jerusalem, Egypt, North Africa, Spain. I mean, it was almost a blitzkrieg of just incredible speed. Um, Within a period of just a couple 300 years, they had uh, almost all of the Middle East, most of North Africa, including Egypt, and on up into Spain, conquered. Um, uh, the mosque. One of the things about the mosque, uh, the and within Islam, okay, um, it did not draw. There wasn't like this special distinction between lay people and clergy. Okay, the Christian church ruled. All right, and um, its laity was very different from its clergy. Okay, bishops and priests had power. I mean, like real power. Yes, there was religious authority within the caliphs, but and yes, they had influence, but they didn't rule, and there wasn't like this separation between them. Um, and the mosque served as meeting house, it served as courthouse, council chamber, all of these different things, and it brought people together. Much like remember when we talked about the agora in Greek tradition, it functioned in much the same way. Um, by about the 11th century or 1000 to 1100, uh, mosques often had a madrasa attached to it or a teaching college, to where religion and education became uh, interweaved. Um, this led to the rise of the ulama, people possessing correct knowledge, which were much like the priests and rabbis. Okay. Um, okay. Um, the Umayyad caliphs left Medina, moved to Damascus, built a new mosque. The community there was shared the site with the Christian community, but the Muslim community grew very rapidly. Um, and the Dome of the Rock was built. Just an amazing structure. Um, one of the things to note is the frequent lack of living entities like people or animals within Islamic art. This is not always the case, but there is a dearth. Many people think that it's actually forbidden. It's not, in fact. Um, but even people of a even people of the Muslim faith, though many of them think that it is. Um, but there was the problem of because much like within the iconoclast that we talked about, does having those create the opportunity for worshiping of a false god? Okay, are these images problematic? And so that's a conflict that was within Islam at the time. Um, as I mentioned, Islam conquered most of North Africa and the great majority of Spain, particularly the southern part of Andalusia. Um, you've probably heard, you might not know it's a real place, but you've probably heard of Timbuktu. That is an actual place in North Africa. Now, one of the things, again, that you hear thrown around, Muhammad accepted slavery. Okay? Um, Slavery was common and still is not all that uncommon, unfortunately, in parts of the Islamic world. Uh, the the way to avoid slavery is to convert, because one Muslim cannot have another Muslim as a slave. Um, so Mansa Musa, Mansa meaning emperor, came to the throne in Malawi. Under him, Timbuktu became this cultural focal point for uh, artists, for scholars. Um, he, the man was rich, like ridiculously wealthy, to the point that when he traveled, he just gave out gold. He bought things at a prodigious rate, to the point to where gold actually became less valuable. He deflated the worth of gold. Um, when he came back, he built mosques throughout his kingdom, libraries, colleges. So the man is one of those lost African rulers that in the West that is not thought about or regarded nearly enough for what he accomplished as a king who promoted scholarship, who promoted infrastructure um, and economics. Uh, okay. So Islamic Spain um, remained under Umayyad control as the Abbasids focused in Damascus. Um, Spain had been largely controlled by Germanic tribes, the Visigoths, um, who had become Christian, um, but a force of Muslim Arabs and Berbers ended up overthrowing them. Cordoba, Sevilla, Toledo, Granada, all that southern part fell largely uh, to Islamic rule. Um, Under the Umayyad Caliphs, Spain thrived intellectually. I mean, really did very well. Religious tolerance uh, was extended to all, um, although Muslims didn't have to pay taxes, so that was the difference. Um, Spanish Jews who have been persecuted under the Visigoths were welcomed, as science and scholarship absolutely flourished. Muslims introduced algebra. They introduced the concept of zero to the West, and Roman numerals, which if you've ever tried to do math in Roman numerals, it is ridiculously clunky and difficult, were replaced by Arabic numerals, which is what we use now. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. I mean, those are Arabic numerals, which is much easier to work with. Um, if you look on 313, you'll see a pyxis, that small cylindrical box, incredibly beautifully decorated, just intricate work. Cordoba had about 500,000 people at this time. Compare that to Paris at the time, right? We think of Paris as this great city uh, in France. Paris had 40,000 people. Okay, this was 12 times the size, and the infrastructure: 1,600 mosques, 900 public baths, 80,000 shops. That means roughly one person in six in the city had their own place of business. I mean, the incredible amount of entrepreneurship that was going on was amazing. Okay, and almost half of the city of 500,000 had running water and lavatories, in-home lavatories, as opposed to a chamber pot where you shit at night and then throw it out into the street and just wait for the rains to wash it away. I mean, just an incredible difference. Um, under uh, it's ironic that under Muslim rule came to be known, or what came to be known as the golden age of Jewish culture, because they were tolerant of Jewish culture. There wasn't the conflict that we currently see. Uh, this false conflict that was created by outside forces. Um, but eventually, the Umayyad Caliphate collapsed. Okay, um, and there came to be taifas. The taifas are smaller competing cities, and much less tolerant of Jews. Jews were expelled, for example, from Granada, despite having lived there with their families living there for centuries. Um, and 1,500 families, not people, families, were killed. Um, I mean, that's several thousand people were just destroyed. Um, there were certain parts that where there was still some tolerance, um, and it was under this that Moses Maimonides, who was one of the most well-known Jewish scholars of all times, thrived. Um, he is the first person to write a systematic summary of Jewish law. Again, we tend to think of law as something that we have written down, point, and that's not the way that all cultures work. Okay, a lot of times it was passed down through oral tradition and memory. Maimonides actually summarized and put into play the Mishnah Torah, as well as one of the great philosophical works of Judaism, the Guide to the Perplexed, um, uh, that really looked at the nature of God. And one of the most famous Christian scholars actually used this as inspiration, St. Thomas of Aquinas. All right. Uh, Music within the Islamic culture, we tend to think of music in these in, in less subtle terms. Okay, we have octaves, right? Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do, right? And we have flats and sharps, which kind of fall a little bit in the middle. Islamic music gets much more subtle. Very it's very tonal. There's a lot of sound through the nose, oh, right, to where we get a different intonation. Um, but whereas we go do, re, right, you might hear do, 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 right. It's almost hard for somebody in a Western culture to go at fractions of a note. We don't hear them because that's not how our music works. But they will go into these really small little micro steps in between notes, what we think of as notes. Um, all right. The what we become known as the guitar started as a slightly different instrument, the kitara, in the Arabic world. Um, and there was actually musical philosophy that studied the effect of music on people's feelings. That the scholar Al-Kindi worked on, to where it's like, okay, what sounds make people feel certain ways, and how can we codify these sounds so that when we want people to feel a certain way, we know what notes to work with, which is really just amazing. Um, New instruments, the trumpets, the viols, kettle drums, all these were invented in the Arabic world at this time, which kind of set into play actually what we know as an orchestra. Um, Islam had paper about 500 years before the Western world did in any kind of volume. Um, at this point, uh, the Sorbonne Library in Paris uh, had about 2,000 works. Okay, and that was considered huge in the Western world. There was a private library in the Islamic world that had over 400,000 texts. And this is because, quite honestly, Westerners weren't that interested in reading, whereas scholarship in the East was much more highly prized. All right, let's talk about the frame tale. Okay, the frame tale. Um, Storytelling in the Eastern world um, oftentimes use what we call the frame tale. And this is something that actually did come over to the Western world as well, but they had it first, like many things. Um, the frame tale is where you tell one story, and then somebody within that story tells another story. So you've probably heard of 1001 Arabian Nights, okay? And now we hear the smaller stories, okay? We get the smaller stories from that plucked out all the time. Aladdin, right? That's one of the stories from the 1001 Arabian Nights. Sinbad the Sailor, Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves. These are all stories that are brought out of the 1001 Arabian Nights, but they're not the frame tale. The frame tale is that there was a woman, Scheherazade, who was married to a sultan who was notorious for killing his wives. And so what she decided to do, she wanted to stay alive. So what she would do is she would start telling him a story each night. But she wouldn't finish the story. He'd be like, well, how does the story end? She's like, oh, I'll tell you tomorrow. And so she would tell the end of the story the next night, but then she'd start another story. And in doing so, she kept herself alive. So that's the frame. That's the outer part of the story, is the story of Scheherazade. Whereas the inner stories are those of Aladdin, of Ali Baba, the stories that she told. So this is what's called a frame tale. Okay, let's talk briefly about Sufism. Okay. Um, the Sufi orders had a wide range of mystical practice. They would often wear uncomfortable garments. Um, Suf is the word for wool, which refers to the harsh woolen garments that they wore. They believed in obtaining divine inspiration through experiences of music, poetry, dance. Um, if you look up whirling dervish, you've probably heard the term at some point, a whirling dervish, but have you ever seen a whirling dervish? This is the Sufi practice of dancing in a circle rapidly, right? In order to try to achieve this mystical connection. Look up whirling dervish. You will be fascinated by the dancing and the speed at which they do it. Um, Probably one of the biggest uh, challenges that Christianity and Islam have had. Islam does see Christ as a prophet, okay? They see Jesus Christ as a prophet. They just don't believe in him as a God or as part of the Godhead. Um, he is a prophet like Muhammad was a prophet, like Abraham was a prophet, okay? All of these were prophets. And so he is revered. But because he was not revered as God, Christians and Islam clash. And there's still kind of this mentality among some as Islam as a fallen form of Christianity, or it's not up to par. And so this is a struggle that we still see to this day. All right, make sure that you keep up with your discussion boards, and I will get chapter 10 to you tomorrow. Have a good one.